Badass of the Week is an iHeartRadio podcast produced by High Five Content. Rain falls on the Parisian night. 4 figures stand in the alley behind a rowdy tavern, each lilting slightly from an excess of wine, yet their minds remain focused on the task at hand. One of them draws a long, thin sword, a rapier that glints in the yellow light of a nearby lantern. She is tall, with piercing blue eyes, dressed similarly to the 3 men who stand opposite her, in the tall boots, breeches, and jacket popular among the French aristocracy towards the end of the 17th century. While the clothes are commonplace in Paris, the sight of a woman wearing such clothing is not. Julie d'Aubigny faces the man who challenged her to meet him here. Dueling is forbidden by order of the Sun King, but that matters not to her. If it's bloodshed he seeks, she's more than happy to oblige him. He catches her gaze, falters, then nods at the men beside him. All 3 draw their blades. She raises an eyebrow. So, it's gonna be like that then. Hello, and welcome back to Badass of the Week. My name is Ben Thompson, and I am joined, as always, by my co-host, Dr. Pat Larish. Pat, how are you doing today?
I'm doing good. I'm excited to talk about our stuff this week.
I am too. This is going to be a really fun one. It's like, do you like music? Do you like sword fighting? Do you like marginalized populations sticking it to the man in 17th century France?
Yes! Who doesn't? And this week, we are talking musicians and duelists. 18th century, technically some 17th century French performers and fencers with, busy personal lives, shall we say?
Yeah, it's a couple of Paris opera badasses from the times of the Sun King, Louis XIV, the Musketeers, the French Revolution. These are people who hooked up with half of Paris, got into sword fights with the other half, and lived like rock stars 300 years before anyone had heard of Bret Michaels or Tommy Lee. It's going to be sex, tavern brawls, conspiracy theories, government intrigues, and a woman who once took holy orders so that she could sneak into a convent and have sex with a nun, and I'm super excited to talk about all of it. Although, Pat, I do have to confess that I have one very serious concern about this week's episode.
Oh, Ben, don't tell me you're doing that thing again where you keep reporting things that were written in 18th century erotica novels as historical facts again.
No. Well, yeah, maybe. But that's not the problem. We'll get into that later. The problem is that, while my French spelling is okay, my French pronunciation is legendarily terrible and embarrassing, and I am looking at a large string of French proper nouns that I will have to pronounce over the course of this episode. I was the vice president of my French club for 3 years, but I never managed to pronounce the R's and the N's and the nasal stuff and most of the other letters. And I'm just gonna... I have a lot of concern that I'm just going to completely annihilate the language in a way that's going to be cringy for anyone who has to listen to it. So I guess, Pat, you are the resident podcast linguist, and from what I hear of you speaking French, it sounds okay. So I think here's what we should do. Why don't you let everybody know who we're going to be talking about today?
Okay, Ben, you're putting me on the spot here, but okay. This week, we are talking about Julie d'Aubigny la Maupin, and we are also talking about Joseph Boulogne, le Chevalier de Saint-Georges.
Okay, perfect. So now, anytime I'm about to butcher these names, maybe our excellent and talented editor, Ian Jacobs, can just splice in Pat's pronunciations instead of mine, so nobody has to be subjected to listening to me speak French. So we're going to go to a quick commercial break right now, but when we come back, we are going to hear the incredible stories of
Julie d'Aubigny la Maupin
and
Joseph Boulogne, le Chevalier de Saint-Georges.
described once by Théophile Gautier as, quote, beautiful, deadly, valiant, and supremely unchaste. Julie d'Aubigny was a 17th century bisexual French opera singer and fencing master who killed or wounded at least 10 men in life or death duels, performed nightly shows on the biggest and most highly respected opera stage in the world, and once took the holy orders just so that she could sneak into a convent and bang a nun. Julie was born in 1673. She was raised by her father, whose name is Gaston, which is great.
No one breeds like Gaston?
Clearly not. Gaston d'Aubigny was the secretary for the Comte d'Armagnac, Grand Squire of France, the guy who helped train pages and horses for Louis XIV, the Sun King, who is one of the greatest rulers in French history. Under the Sun King's reign, France became a world superpower. It dominated Europe, and this is also, if you're trying to kind of place this historically, it's roughly the time of the Musketeers, like with this high romantic time period of French history. Think Dumas novels, that sort of thing.
Count of Monte Cristo, etc.
Exactly. So Gaston's daughter, Julie d'Aubigny, she was tall. She grew to be a tall, beautiful woman. She had dark auburn hair and piercing blue eyes. And her dad was a pretty badass guy. I know that, like, the secretary to the count doesn't sound like a hardcore profession, but part of Gaston's job description was to train aristocrats in sword fighting, horseback riding, and other manly endeavors. So he, of course, also made sure his daughter was well trained in these things as well. Even though that was really unorthodox for the day, Gastons are going to Gaston, and he was determined that any child of his was going to know how to kick someone's ass in a sword fight.
So we're making Beauty and the Beast jokes here, but that mental image is kind of starting to sound accurate.
I only picture him as the cartoon character. Well, Julie becomes amazing at all of these martial, traditionally male-dominated arts, which makes sense because she's being trained by the guy who trains the king's personal household guard. And that's going well and all, but around the time she's like 15, she ends up having an affair with the Count d'Armagnac, who, we should remind you, is Gaston's boss. And Gaston, yeah, it's not great. Gaston, of course, panics, and he decides that the best solution here is to marry Julie off to some mild-mannered older French clerk named Monsieur Maupin, and that will calm her down.
And I'm sure that worked.
It might surprise you to find that it did not.
This, in fact, does not surprise me at all.
So, when presented with a French noblewoman's life in some nice, quiet little manor outside of Paris, Julie d'Aubigny, of course, decided it would be much more fun to hook up with a traveling sword fighter and run off with him instead. So that's what she did.
Like you do.
Yeah. She stayed married to Monsieur Maupin for the rest of her life, and that's where the La Maupin comes from, because she's technically Madame Maupin. But this is kind of the extent of the influence that Monsieur Maupin will have on her life, and from this point on, he will basically disappear from the story.
Okay, so tell us about the swordsman then.
So the swordsman's name is Seran. Sehan. I said I can't do the R's and the N's, and this guy has two of each. So how would you say this?
Seran. Or we could just call him Saran.
Saran. Okay.
Like Saran wrap, but
sure, like
different.
But not Cyrano. Got it. Okay. Like Saran wrap. I think I could do this.
Yeah.
my language coach here. Okay, so the guy's name is Saran, and they run off to Marseille, and they have adventures together like you do when you are traveling swordsman in 17th century France. And yeah, this is, like I said, this is where the ghost of my high school French teacher comes back to haunt me, because I'm just going to keep butchering all of these names, and I'm sorry about it.
No, you're doing okay. You're doing okay. At least you're making an effort. Continue. Carry on.
Okay. So Julie d'Aubigny and Saran travel around, and Saran gets in trouble for killing a guy in a sword fight. They're fighting a duel, and Saran ends up killing the guy. I don't have a lot of details about it, but the duel took place behind a monastery, and Saran's opponent died. And at the time, dueling was illegal in France. Now, I know that when you think about 17th century France and musketeer era types of adventures, you think about guys in fancy costumes, fencing and rapier duels to defend their honor, and that was totally happening all over the place. But Louis XIV was starting to get a little tired of all of these French aristocrats being stabbed to death behind monasteries and in dark alleys and things, so he outlawed it. The outlaw wasn't super effective. People still fought all the time. But it turned out that Suran in particular was getting a little extra attention from the police because the chief of police investigating this dueling murder was actually a good friend of the Comte d'Armagnac, the Grand Squire of France.
And Julie's ex-lover, right?
Yeah. So Julie's ex-boyfriend gets her new boyfriend arrested, and now he's a wanted murderer. He goes on the run, which probably only makes him sexier to Julie d'Aubigny, and the two of them start wandering around France incognito.
So how do they manage this?
So to make money for their adventures, they started putting on sword fighting exhibitions.
Sword fighting exhibitions? Like what?
So, like the buskers outside the hotels in Vegas who do magic tricks and stuff and you put money in a hat.
Oh, yeah. Like the musicians in the New York City subway system.
Exactly.
Yeah, there's some real talent there sometimes.
Yeah, and there was here as well, musically even, in addition to sword fighting. It turns out that not only was Julie d'Aubigny an amazing fencer, she also had an incredible contralto voice.
So pretty deep. Yeah, it's the lowest of the traditionally female ranges. Yeah. And what did she do with this extraordinarily deep contralto voice?
Well, she did sword fighting exhibitions with singing. So try to picture this for a moment. There's a bar. It's rowdy. People are drinking and carousing, 17th century France, big hoop skirts and, men dressed kind of like musketeers kind of era. There's a woman in men's clothing, and she gets on stage. She's got pants, tall boots, a wide-brimmed hat. She's dressed like the Count of Monte Cristo. She starts singing...
Or Puss in Boots.
Or Puss in Boots, exactly.
Or the Count of Monte Cristo.
Or the Count... Well, if she was dressed like Puss in Boots, then she wouldn't have any pants or a shirt on, which would be kind of weird.
Oh, that's true.
It would just be a sword belt and boots, which is probably...
Yeah. Oh.
Probably not even okay in 17th century France.
Yeah. Okay, so she's dressed like the Count of Monte Cristo.
Yes. She gets up on stage and she starts singing a beautiful song. But there's a fencing sword in a scabbard at her hip. Not an edged rapier, but a dueling one, and she draws it. It's blunt on the edges and at the point, but similar in weight and size to the real thing. She starts singing, but she also, into her song, incorporates a challenge for any man to get up there and face her in a sword fight. If they defeat her, she'll give them some money or some of her earnings for the night. But if not, they owe her instead. A few eager guys want in on it, and she chooses one of them to climb on stage. She has a matching fencing sword for him. Again, dull, not gonna draw blood. But now they're gonna duel. And they fight. She parries all of his attacks easily, like something out of the Matrix. All the while, she's singing in her opera-quality, contralto, deep voice about how much this guy sucks at fighting, how poorly he's dressed, how stupid his hair is. And then, as a finale, as this guy's getting madder and madder, with a single swipe of her weapon, she disarms him in time to the ending of her little freestyle rap kind of song she's doing.
Woohoo.
The crowd goes crazy. The defeated and humiliated Frenchman puts money into her hat, and the rest of the crowd does as well as a reward for the great show. This is the show that Julie d'Aubigny puts on, night after night, week after week, to pay for her adventures across the French countryside.
So she's good at multitasking.
And singing, I think, requires good posture, so I'm not sure how that works with sword fighting.
Well, these are two very difficult things, and she's performing both of them at a very high level. Not to mention that you said she's an opera singer, so I'm imagining these operatic arias she's singing, which is really, it's just next level.
Absolutely. And she's doing it all while dressed as a man, which annoys some guys, but also intrigues some of the French women in the audience at these performances. She starts getting some attention from women who mistake her for a man at first. And that's where we get into one of my favorite Julie d'Aubigny stories.
Ooh la la.
So by 1693, La Maupin is a bit of a bigger star, and she decides she's getting bored of Suran. Not only is he not as successful as her, bringing in money for their show, but now she's starting to be able to defeat him in sword fights more often than not, and that, of course, makes him significantly less interesting to her. Plus, he's a wanted murderer, which kind of cramps her style, even though it's kind of her fault that he's a wanted murderer, but we're not going to get into that. So Like I said, she's getting more and more attention from female fans. And one day she's in Marseille and she starts sleeping with the daughter of a wealthy merchant. He's got a beautiful young blonde daughter named Cecilia Bortigali. And Julie and Cecilia end up being together, and that's going on for a while until Cecilia's father finds out. And Pat, what do you do when you're a wealthy 17th century Frenchman who is well respected in the community, and word gets back that your sweet, lovely daughter is having a torrid lesbian affair with a wandering sword fighter?
Specifically a wandering swords woman.
Yes.
Well, yeah. Well, I might start by saying a bad word like sacré bleu. Or maybe I would grab a pointy object to, stick people with.
Those are both good options, but Monsieur Bortigali instead chooses another option that he has available to him and that was available to fathers at the time. He sends her off to a convent.
Ooh, get thee to a nunnery.
Exactly. And knowing what we know about Julie d'Aubigny, do we suspect that her having her hot girlfriend shipped off to a convent would deter her or encourage her?
Given that this is Julie d'Aubigny, I'm going to suspect the latter. I'm suspecting that this is perhaps a spur to her creativity.
Yeah, if there's one thing about Julie d'Aubigny, it's that she does not like to be told what to do and who she can do it with. So what's the plan? Well, she goes to Avignon, where Cecilia is in the convent. Julie takes holy orders, she joins the convent, and she becomes a nun.
Wait. How long does it take to join holy orders? I thought there was like a training period, a novitiate period, or a waiting period or something like that. And isn't she still technically married? Doesn't that kind of preclude one from taking holy orders? Aren't these mutually exclusive things?
I honestly have no idea how she pulled this off. I guess she found the right mother superior with the right size bag of gold, or perhaps she was just really persuasive and had that kind of like magnetic, charismatic personality that allows you to bluff your way into a convent despite, being La Maupin. We will see this charisma come back again and again as we go through more stories of her, but I don't know. I'm not sure. I do know that she joins the convent and immediately continues her torrid affair with Cecilia, only now inside of a convent. It's kind of romantic, honestly.
Yeah, kind of romantic. And it can't be easy to carry on an affair like that when you're, surrounded by nuns.
No. And Julie d'Aubigny, of course, has no intention of living out the rest of her days in a convent. So she makes a plan to escape with Cecile. One day, one of the older nuns passes away, and they have a big funeral for her. Julie d'Aubigny waits a day or two, and then, one night, she comes up with a plan. She grabs a shovel and some lamp oil. Under the cover of darkness, in the middle of the night, she goes out to the graveyard and begins digging. She digs up the recently deceased nun, then recovers her grave. She drags the body to Cecile's room, tucks it into her bed, covers it in lamp oil, and sets it on fire. The blaze starts to spiral out of control, and a big portion of the convent immediately starts to go up in flames. Maupin grabs Cecilia's hand and they run for it, their exit covered by the blaze, and the next day, when the nuns and the fire department are clearing out the blaze, they find a dead body in Cecilia's bed, indicating that perhaps she was killed in the blaze. Maupin and Cecilia then spend the next 3 months living in an apartment together on the Loire River.
So you're saying that Julie set a convent on fire to help her lover fake her own death so they could escape and be together.
Yes.
Cool story, but this sounds like the 18th century erotic fan fiction stuff we were referencing at the top of the show.
You'd think so, right? The life of La Maupin was fascinating for years after her exploits, and plenty of sensationalized books were written about her in the 18th century and 19th century, full of, gory and lurid details and outlandish stories and tons of debauchery. But this story is true, and I can prove it because she was arrested for this crime, and there is public record of it.
Wow. You saved the receipts.
I mean, that's assuming that she's, did the things that she's allegedly being charged of doing. But this was a story that existed during her lifetime.
Yeah. What a story it is. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So, yeah, she gets called in front of the court, and we have documents indicating that Monsieur Maupin was sentenced to death by burning at the stake, like a witch style.
Wait, Monsieur Maupin. So they used the masculine form of her name?
Yes, because in 17th century France, digging up a dead nun and setting her on fire is sacrilegious and scandalous, but it's not as scandalous as a lesbian relationship, so they got to call her Monsieur Maupin.
So does she go out in a blaze of glory, as it were, being burned at the stake?
No, not quite. She flees and basically lays low for the next few months. She turns up again 3 months later, performing at a club in Paris. She's still doing the sword fighting and singing exhibitions. Well, during one of her shows, I guess she made the wrong guy angry, or maybe she got into a fight with him after the show, but somebody took exception to something she was doing in her performance, and they decided to take it outside. This is the part that we talk about at the top of the show. This guy felt like his honor was slandered, and La Maupin was more than happy to go and duel him if that's what he wanted. And so they go out behind the bar into an alley, and they face off. It is Maupin and this other guy, and his two buddies are with him. Now, in an honorable duel, it would be one-on-one, and those two guys would say, oh, yes, good duel, well done. But on this particular occasion, all three guys across from Le Maupin draw their weapons, and they all jump her at the same time. It's extremely dishonorable for dueling, but that's what happens. Maupin, of course, puts the two buddies on the ground almost immediately, and then plants her sword into the main guy's chest so hard that the point of the blade sticks 6 inches out the back of his torso.
Ooh, that's gotta hurt.
It probably did not feel great. So yeah, he goes down, and she decides to just leave all three of them bleeding in the street. A little bit later, someone who maybe caught wind of what had happened or maybe saw it goes to La Maupin, and they say, did you know who those guys were? And she's like, no, I don't care. But the person is like, well, it turns out that guy's actually a freaking count. He's Louis-Joseph d'Albert de Luynes, Comte d'Albert, son of the Duke of Luynes. And Julie's like, oh, crap. And she has to go visit the guy in the hospital because she's like, actually, that guy's like a pretty big deal. I probably shouldn't have, I maybe almost killed him.
So he lives?
He lives. He lives, and she goes to the hospital to talk to him. And of course, not long after, they become lovers because that's how Julie d'Aubigny rolls. And they end up staying friends for the rest of their lives. They write each other letters for years to come. And that goes back to what I was saying earlier about how charismatic Julie d'Aubigny is. Even after she stabbed that guy in the chest, the Count was like, oh, hey, well, yeah, I mean, what are you doing after, though?
I guess stabbing people with pointy objects is Julie's love language.
That is pretty accurate, I think. Well, okay, now she's in Paris, and she still does have this condemned woman thing going on where she's supposed to be burned at the stake. So she really doesn't want that to happen. So she has to start looking for people who might help her. And there's one guy in Paris who might be able to help, the Count d'Armagnac.
The Count d'Armagnac. This was the boss of her father, Gaston, right? The Grand Squire of France, who was also her former lover and the guy who got Sirron sentenced to death for dueling. Is this that guy we're talking about?
This is the same guy, the same Count d'Armagnac. They haven't talked much since she left town, but they're like still friends on Facebook or whatever the equivalent was. Yeah, exactly. So she figures, why not? We'll give it a try. And she sneaks into his palace one night. The Count comes home and enters his dressing room, and there's Julie d'Aubigny sitting there with her feet up on the table like, hey, remember me? I could use some help.
This is like a Batman move or something.
Yeah, and she's like Julie d'Aubigny is like Batman meets James Bond, meets like the Three Musketeers, Casanova, and I don't know, Taylor Swift or something. I don't know. I'm really surprised we haven't seen, she's very popular in France. It's a very popular story, at least earlier,
yeah.
She's a very popular story in France, but we haven't seen much about her in media in the US.
But what does the Count say to this? Is he upset to find his ex-lover in his dressing room asking him for a political favor?
Not at all, because as we know, and as we have seen repeatedly, Julie d'Aubigny was charismatic enough to convince anyone to do anything she wanted. So the Count was super impressed by her huge brass balls or equivalent or whatever, and he says he's going to put in a word for her with the Sun King. And Louis XIV pardons her. He officially pardons her at the Parliament of Aix. X.
Yeah, roll with it.
At the Parliament of Aix, Louis officially pardons her from her death sentence. And she takes advantage of her newfound freedom. She auditions for the Paris Opera. She's rejected. She tries again. She's rejected again. She goes to another person. So then she goes to another person she knows who has like a backdoor in and auditions for him. He likes her and gets her in, and then within a few months, she's the lead contralto for the Paris Opera. She's playing roles like Athena, Dido, and Medea, all similarly badass women from history.
Yes, all badass mythological women, but badass in very different ways. So it would appear that in addition to a good voice, Julie d'Aubigny also had quite an acting range.
I feel like I should mention here that Julie d'Aubigny is 20 years old at this point in the story. Like, all the stuff I've described up until this point happened between the ages of 15 and 20.
Wow.
So now she's performing nightly on the stage at the Paris Opera. And opera singers at this time are the biggest pop culture stars of the day. I mean, there's like nothing else to do for fun in Paris in 1700, right? You couldn't watch Netflix or go to the movies or listen to recordings of music. You had to go see this stuff live if you wanted to be entertained by visuals and music and acting. And so, as the lead in the opera, Julie d'Aubigny is kind of like a rock star. And she does the rock star thing. She duels and fights and sleeps with everybody she can get her hands on, and then she goes to the after party and does it all over again.
Living her best life, I suppose.
Exactly. So she's this big time star and she gets invited to all the big parties. And if you were Parisian nobility, you would have wanted her to come to your parties because she's a big star and she's really fun at parties. So she gets invited to a ball that's hosted at the palace of the Sun King, Louis XIV. She goes, and I assume this means Versailles. She shows up at this royal party and she's dressed as a cavalier, the clothing we've seen her wear before for her sword fighting exhibitions, with the tight pants and the boots, the flowing shirt and the big hat.
So not a big ball gown or hoop skirt. This is fancy men's clothes. Couture you can fence in. Yes,
she is dressed as a man. So she arrives, and everyone here is dressed out their best. I'm picturing Versailles. It's the royal ball, the palace of the Sun King. He's gonna be there. This is like some Cinderella shit. Opulent food, champagne, gold and jewels on women's necks and lining the serving trays, the walls, filigree on the ceilings. Think like, I don't know, prom with like Marie Antoinette vibes. See and be seen, the highest nobility, the richest people in the richest country on earth. And into the middle of this party saunters Julie d'Aubigny, La Maupin, with a rapier on her sword belt. And she's in the center of the ballroom, dancing on the dance floor with all of the sexy women. Well, she starts dancing with this one woman that apparently many of the men there were trying to dance with. And this woman, I don't know her name, she only wants to dance with La Maupin. And Julie is very happy to accommodate her. And at some point, at the height of one of the songs, La Maupin, Julie d'Aubigny, kisses this woman and they start making out on the dance floor in front of the Sun King.
Ooh la la.
Well, if you remember, the court was ready to burn this woman at the stake for setting a convent on fire, but they were still too embarrassed to mention that it was because of a lesbian relationship and referred to Maupin as Monsieur Maupin, the masculine form of her name. So this is too much to bear. 3 guys approach her. They're well-dressed aristocrats. They're wearing roughly the same style of clothes that she is, right down to the swords hanging from their belt. They also happen to be 3 guys who really wanted to have a chance to dance with that woman, and they weren't that happy that Maupin stole her away. But that's not what they say they're there for. They say they're there to defend the honor of the Sun King. She's being disrespectful to him, and they have to defend his honor. Julie looks them over, she smiles, and she says, "Why don't we take this outside?" So they do. They go outside. They draw their weapons on the steps of the palace, with horrified guests looking on, or probably intrigued as well. And one by one after the other, remember I said with duels, even including multiple people, it was honorable to fight them one at a time, not all at once. And if you're going to fight at Versailles, if you're going to sword fight at Versailles, you better follow the rules. So she fights them, and one after the other, she leaves them all bloodied and defeated in the street. Then she sheathes her weapon, turns around, calmly walks back into the party, grabs a fresh glass of champagne, finds the woman she was talking to earlier, puts her arm around her, and is like, "So, where were we?"
So yeah, that's extremely cool. But didn't you say that the Sun King made dueling illegal? And isn't Julie, having a duel in his front yard?
Yes. And as cool as Louis XIV was, and as much as he liked Julie d'Aubigny, he really couldn't look the other way on this one. So Julie is arrested. But Louis does like her, and badass recognizes badass, so he made a fun exception for her. He told the courts that the law, as written, said that no man can duel in France.
But Julie is no man.
And so, instead of jail, she is sent to Belgium.
That seems better.
Probably. I've never been to Belgium, but I've never really heard anything bad about it.
Well, as we're recording this, my parents are on a plane to Belgium for a trip.
So they can report back about whether it's better than jail.
Yes. I don't know if they've ever been in jail, but yes, they can report on Belgium.
Fair enough. So Maupin goes to Belgium, and she's rumored there to have become lovers with Maximilian Emanuel, the Elector of Bavaria, who was a pretty powerful German prince. Maximilian Emanuel was one of the main claimants for inheriting the Spanish crown at the time he was having this alleged affair with Julie d'Aubigny, and he was in Belgium fighting on the French side in the War of the Spanish Succession. So she spends a little bit of time in Belgium. Eventually things blow over. She comes back. She continues singing in the Paris Opera, and she finds a lot of success there. She eventually retires in 1705 and dies 2 years later in 1707 at the age of 34 of causes that are not known. But yeah, everything that happened in the story up until this point happened before the age of 35.
Overachiever.
Yes, it is very depressing, but it's also pretty awesome. Julie d'Aubigny kind of becomes this folk hero, especially in the time period when she lived. She's the rock star opera singer who got into sword fights and made out with women. And, it's funny because when you read about her, everybody's so scandalized by the things she's doing, yet she's able to talk her way out anytime she gets into trouble. And the more trouble she gets herself into, the more people seem to like her. Even stabbing a guy in the front yard of the king isn't a deal breaker for her popularity. She lived fast, she died young, and after her death, people continued writing stories about her. Some of it is, most of it is, like you said earlier, erotic fanfic, but there's all kinds of other good stuff. There's adventure stories and other things of that nature. And she really captivated all of France with her exploits, and I think it's just such an awesome story.
Well then, how about we move on to another story of a badass sword-fighting Paris musician, someone who similarly captivated all of France with his own amazing exploits, getting into street duels, making beautiful music, and having a similar social calendar? When we come back, let's talk about Joseph Boulogne, le Chevalier de Saint-Georges. Hey, welcome back. Now we're going to talk about Joseph Boulogne, the Chevalier de Saint-Georges. He was born in 1745 on the Caribbean island of Guadeloupe. At the time, it was a French colony. His father was a French commoner, and his mother was an enslaved Senegalese woman named Nanon. And as someone of mixed race in that time and place, there were a lot of barriers to achieving fame and success. Joseph Boulogne does not let that stop him. He died one of the most famous men in France under an aristocratic title and stage name, the Chevalier de Saint-Georges. His father, who was named Georges Boulogne de Saint-Georges, had come to Guadeloupe to set up a plantation. He marries one of his slaves. He gets awarded a title of minor nobility, which was a big deal in those days. As it turns out, At a certain point, he has to leave the island. He may, sources are not entirely clear on this, but he may have murdered a guy in a sword fight.
That seems to be a common theme among these stories that we're talking about today.
It does.
It's like,
it does.
Like if you told me right now that somebody that I knew had to leave town because they murdered somebody in a sword fight, it would be surprising. But when we were talking about people from this time period of French history, it's not that weird. I just go killed a guy with a sword fight. Yeah, no, that happens.
Yeah, that happens. And instead of going to Belgium, he goes to France. He takes his family to France, and they're living in Bordeaux. He's mixed race. His father acknowledges Joseph as his son, gives him his last name. And at age 13, Joseph enrolls in Boissier's Academy of Fencing and Horsemanship.
It's kind of like a Hogwarts-y kind of name.
It is, yeah.
I like it.
Yeah. I suppose at both places you've got a long, pointy thing that you can do amazing deeds with.
And blast people with, yeah.
Yeah. By age 15, he's totally kicking ass in fencing duels, which I would like to point out are non-fatal. And at age 17, he's noted for acting at the greatest speed imaginable. And people in general, keep in mind, were much more used to using swords than we are today. So if someone's going to be good at fencing, it means that they've had a lot more competition than you or I might if we were to do fencing.
Yeah, exactly. And so they're fencing kind of what we talked about with Julie d'Aubigny with these blunted weapons. It's the kind of competition you see when you watch fencing in the Olympics, basically. But but yeah, all of the aristocracy of France learned to fight with a sword. There were guns at this time period, but the officers carried swords and pistols, right? And that was the aristocratic nobility, gentlemanly thing to do was to carry a sword and fight with it. So to be the best of the best at sword fighting in France at this time is very difficult.
Indeed, yes. And in addition to that, Joseph is also a champion runner, a pistol marksman. One of the ways he did cardio training was by swimming across the River Seine with only one arm. He held his other arm behind his back. That was a thing that people did in those days.
That's a thing that people did if you were Joseph Boulogne. I don't think that's a thing that you and me could do if we tried to jump into the Seine today.
I can't even imagine how to do that. But he did it. He did it. Now, despite all this, he still had to deal with racism. French law was, in fact, racist. There were things that Joseph, being a person of color, was prevented from doing, at least on paper. He didn't let that stop him in practice, as we'll see. But in addition to whatever the legal nuances were of what he could or could not do, he also had to face just general racism from people. Joseph, the star student at Boissier's Academy of Fencing and Horsemanship, attracts a lot of attention for his athletic prowess. And Boissier's Academy has a rival school in Rouen, and the fencing master from the school in Rouen calls Joseph racial slurs. I'm not going to repeat them here, but use your imagination. Trust me, they were bad. And he challenges Joseph to a showdown.
Wow.
So this
is the fencing master at a rival school. And Joseph is, 17 or something, 18 at this point? He's a teenager. He's a student at this other school. But this fencing master from a rival school is so upset that there is a person of color kicking everyone's ass in this other city that he challenges that kid specifically to a fight, to a duel. Just to put him in his place, I guess. I don't know. Yes. So the Rouen fencing master named Alexandre Picard challenges Joseph to a showdown. Joseph accepts the challenge. And this is a high-profile thing. It's not just, two people in a back alley somewhere or two people in a salon somewhere with like half a dozen people watching. This gets a lot of buzz. Hundreds of people
are in the audience. They're coming from all across France. It's billed as, honestly, as a demonstration of should France abolish slavery? It's like almost a Jackie Robinson thing.
Wow, yeah, he's Jackie Robinson. Dang, that's...
Yeah. It's not just about his fencing ability. There's a lot of symbolism here. There's a lot riding on this.
No pressure, kid, right? He's 17. He's facing somebody who teaches this professionally and has been doing it for decades in front of a huge audience with so much riding on his shoulders.
Mm-hmm. So there's this fencing duel. Joseph had said to the fencing master, okay, you want to fight about this? Let's fight about this. And the fencing master, Picard, says, make it so. They duel in front of a huge audience. And what do you think happens?
I'm going to guess Joseph wins.
Yeah, of course. He wins. He wins. He wins.
Down goes Picard.
Down goes Picard, yes. Yeah. So Joseph has that feather in his cap. Might be.
And the crowd loves it. The crowd goes crazy. They're happy about it. I bet it's probably pretty awesome. Yeah. So this blows over. Joseph graduates. After he graduates, he gets a position in the King's Royal Guard. And that's actually where he gets his nobility title, the Chevalier de Saint-Georges. And actually, technically, since he's a person of color, he's technically not allowed to have a title legally, but whatever. And Chevalier is like is a knight, right? So he's kind of the Knight of St. George. Like that's really cool. Yeah.
And in addition to that, in the main fighting hall of his school, Boissier's Academy of Fencing and Horsemanship, in the main fighting hall, they hang up Joseph's swords and his portrait.
Wow. That's a big honor. He's like a big sports hero for that school. And I mean, what a great honor.
Yeah, they're proud of him. He's a role model. Yeah. So he's now embarking on his adult life. He's in Bordeaux again. He parties his ass off. He attends balls. He fights in demonstration matches. He attends concerts. He goes to operas. And then in 1769, he whips out a violin and he just shreds. He's playing in public, and the public is astounded because they had been thinking of Joseph as, oh yeah, that hotshot fencing star. But it turns out he's got other talents too. He's performing his own compositions, but people really come for the performance aspect. They want to see him perform.
He's got like a great stage presence. He's Jimi Hendrix and Jackie Robinson put together.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
With a sword.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. And it seems like on stage is not the only place he can perform, because French noblewomen who are not legally allowed to marry men of African descent like to sleep with him. So he has a pretty busy social life.
A total rock star.
He's a rock star. Somehow he comes to the attention of none other than Marie Antoinette herself. And she, as she sometimes does, disguises herself as an ordinary noblewoman rather than the queen, and hangs out with him. She plays music with him in a chamber ensemble. Joseph Boulogne becomes a superstar for both music and fencing. And he manages a concert hall. He composes operas. And he's pretty good at ignoring racism, but, there's still problems that bubble up from time to time. He has this amazing resume, and he's tapped to run none other than the Paris Opera, which you might know from such great hits as the story of Julie d'Aubigny.
There's so many interesting parallels between the two. It's so cool.
Yeah. But he bumps up against the divas. And when I say divas, I mean literally divas, as in opera singers. The divas complained about working for a person of color.
Is diva what you call diva's a word for an opera singer? Is that where that comes from?
So, the word diva today is giving opera singers a bad name. Like, oh, she's such a diva. But this is not to say that you didn't have opera singers who were kind of petty back in the day also.
As we have just seen.
Yes. Yeah. So the Paris opera divas, the Paris opera singers, complained about working for a person of color. So the king and queen of France intervene, and they offer to reinstate Joseph and affirm his authority.
Because Marie Antoinette likes him. Probably shouldn't mess with the dude who's like friends with Marie Antoinette.
Yeah. But Joseph, he's thinking, do I really want to deal with all this nonsense? No. He goes to London. And when he's in London, he's, Joseph Boulogning all over the place, impressing people with music, with fencing. He even manages to give a speech to the Parliament of England, which is to say the Parliament of someone else's country, about ending slavery. So, I guess he's one of those celebrities who also engages in activism.
Yeah, and this is kind of I think we're approaching the end of slavery in Europe at this time, right? I don't have a great time frame in my head for when France abolished slavery, but I think it's around this time. There's at least activism and talks moving that direction. And so for him to kind of use his celebrity in that way is pretty cool, I think.
Yeah. And while he's in London, he's walking home one evening, through the streets of London. Maybe he's turning a few heads because he's famous, he's good looking. But, this is a strange city, so he's maybe also keeping his eyes open around him. And this is a good thing because he's walking along, he turns a corner, and this guy jumps out and demands his wallet. Oh, really? Thinks Joseph. He can defend himself. He puts the smackdown on that mugger. But this might not be just a random mugging. That first guy's done for him, but all of a sudden, 4 other guys jump him. So he thrusts, he parries, but this is no mere exhibition match. It's legit self-defense. He punches him in the teeth. He punches him elsewhere. The police show up, but as a witness at the time said, Joseph Boulogne, quote, put them out of commission. I'll leave you to fill in the details. So that's our Joseph. He's defending himself abroad as well as at home. He goes back to France.
Yeah, he'll kick your ass anytime, any place, anywhere. In front of thousands of people or in a back alley somewhere when you're trying to hit him in the back of the head.
Eventually, he heads back to France, and he's hanging out in the city of Lille on the border with the Netherlands. And Lille, like many cities, has a city fencing tournament. Of course, he enters. Of course, he wins. But then Joseph falls into a coma for 4 whole days because apparently during the tournament, he had been dealing with fever and meningitis.
It's like Jordan hitting that game-winning shot when he had the 103-degree fever in the NBA Finals.
Yeah. So, okay, I'm just keeping track here. So we're calling Joseph the Jackie Robinson / Jimi Hendrix /
Michael Jordan.
Michael Jordan.
He had some Bret Michaels in there too. He's all kinds of things. Yeah. He's a unique person in history and for that time and place. Yeah.
Yeah. So fortunately, Joseph recovers from the illness that he had been rhino hiding through during the Lille fencing tournament. He joins the National Guard. He serves in the Battle of Bessieux, where he fights against Austria.
Yeah, and the National Guard here is not like the U.S. National Guard. This isn't 1 weekend a month and 2 weeks in the summer. This is the French Revolution Army, the army of the French Revolution. They are fighting to they've overthrown the king and the queen, Marie Antoinette, as much as she likes Joseph Boulogne. She's gotten her head chopped off by a guillotine now. And all of the other countries of Europe attack France because they've overthrown their king, and that's not going to work out for the rest of the kings of Europe. They don't like that. So everybody attacks France. And the National Guard is the army that fights against them for the independence of France to kind of preserve the revolution. So he joins that movement and joins the army to fight to preserve the, loyauté, égalité, fraternité. What's the first word of that?
Yeah, liberté, égalité, fraternité.
So he fights to preserve the liberté, égalité, fraternité of the French Revolution. And his second in command, he creates the regiment, the Saint-Georges, and his second in command is a guy named Thomas Alexandre Dumas. And Thomas Alexandre Dumas is the father of the famous author that we've referenced a couple times here, who did the Count of Monte Cristo and who did the Three Musketeers, Man in the Iron Mask. Thomas Alexandre Dumas. Yeah. I'm just going to divert the conversation for a second to talk about him because he's another badass Frenchman of color from the same time period who was friends with Joseph Boulogne. He was born in Haiti. He enlisted as a private and he made it to general. He rose all the way through the ranks from the lowest rank to the highest rank. And he was the only black military commander in history to serve as the overall commander of a predominantly white army-sized force, right up until Colin Powell in Iraq 250 years after Dumas's death. He had superhuman strength. He was a great sword fighter, and he was famous for once single-handedly holding a bridge. During this campaign, it wasn't at the Battle of Baizou, but it was a little bit after. He was a colonel at the time, and he single-handedly held a bridge against a dozen Austrian dragoons using only his saber. It was at the Battle of Clausen, and Napoleon dubbed him the Cocles of Clausen after Horatius Cocles at the bridge. He asked Dumas, what can I do to reward you? And Dumas said, well, I really messed my sword up, like braining it off the heads of 17 different Austrian guys. So Napoleon gave him a new saber called the Saber of Honor, which I like.
Yes, the Saber of Honor.
We'll probably talk about Dumas at some point, so I don't want to get too much into him because I imagine we will get into that story at some point in a future episode.
Yes. And so with, such an amazing person and others serving with him.
He was second in command, so Saint-Georges was the commander, and this guy, as badass as he was still the XO in that military outfit. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So Joseph led his unit with distinction, and the French Revolution started off good. It was all about liberté, égalité, fraternité, but then things started to turn to the reign of terror. So what does that mean for our Joseph? Well, all that partying with the aristocrats and playing string quartets with Marie Antoinette isn't a good look during the French Revolution. And Joseph Boulogne was arrested during the Reign of Terror. He was condemned by critics for being involved in non-revolutionary activities such as music events.
So him playing in the National Guard in the War of the French Revolution was not revolutionary enough because he was also wasting his time playing the violin.
Yes.
He could have been doing revolutionary things when instead he was practicing as concertos.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. I think jam sessions with Marie Antoinette is definitely not a good look.
That is not a good look, yeah.
But even just music in general, it's like, no, you're not spending every waking hour doing revolutionary things. Therefore, you are a problem.
Even though him being awesome at music was revolutionary, if honestly.
Yes. Yeah. So what was in store for him? Would he go the way of Marie Antoinette and lose his head to an oversized state-of-the-art bagel cutter? Well, he festered in prison for 13 months, and I would like to say that he found a way to escape, maybe involving digging his way out with a spoon. He did not actually escape from prison.
It was only 13 months. Give him a little bit more time. He could have escaped, I bet.
Yeah. He never was actually charged with a crime, which probably was a good thing for him.
And probably accurate. He probably didn't actually commit a crime. I don't think playing the violin is a crime.
No, it isn't. Yeah. I feel like I should make some joke here. Like, I don't know, playing a violin out of tune should be a crime, but...
Oh, yeah. I've definitely heard people play violin or people practice it, which it should be a crime. Yeah, that's fair.
Yeah. Okay, now I have to say, hey, badass listeners, if you're learning violin and you're practicing, you know what? Just keep doing it. Don't listen to us. Make a mess.
Hey,
play out of tune.
Yeah, that's actually the whole...
And then get better at it.
That is the whole point of Badass of the Week in general. It's all about people who tried something and failed and then came back and succeeded. So you can't be good until you've messed up a bunch. So I think that's probably true of Joseph Boulogne's sword fighting and playing the violin and all of the other things. You can't get good without a little bit of practice.
Yeah. So after he gets out of prison, well, our sources are maybe a little vague on this. It's a little hard to tell exactly what he's been doing, but he may have actually gone with some of his former men to fight in Haiti, where there was the Haitian Revolution going on. But Joseph would have been fighting against Toussaint Louverture. This has never quite been confirmed.
Well, I imagine we'll talk about that revolution at some point in the future as well, because Toussaint Louverture was pretty badass. But it's interesting that he would have gone to fight. I guess it makes sense. He would have gone to fight for France against the revolution there. But it is interesting.
Yeah. And eventually Joseph settles down, which for him means composing, playing and producing music. He died in 1799 at the age of 53.
Also an early death.
Yeah. Early death, but a very full life.
Yeah, and that's kind of true for both of our stories. We have two people who lived fast, died young. They were rock stars in Paris. They were associated, even ancillary, with the Paris Opera. And they both made their living by fighting and performing and by being charismatic and winning people over. And that's kind of both of our characters we've talked about today. We have two heroes of France at this time period, from the Sun King to the Revolution. They were rock stars who could fight and perform and were also extremely charismatic. And I think that that's a couple of really cool stories of people who, had the odds stacked against them in a lot of ways, but persevered and were able to kick ass and left these amazing, awesome stories, and would probably be extremely fun to hang out with if you could time travel back in time to meet them. I do want to talk for a minute about the sources we used while we were doing this episode. Mm-hmm. Richard Cohen's By the Sword covers both of these characters. And for Maupin, Gautier wrote Mademoiselle de Maupin. Ellen Clayton wrote Queens of Song, and Cameron Rogers did Gallant Ladies, and E.L. Carey did The Sketchbook of Character. And all of these books are about 100 years old and are only browsable on Google Books, but they're good. And there was a great website by a guy named Jim Burrows, and it was called The Adventures of La Maupin, that has tons of information as well.
And for Joseph Boulogne, Chevalier de Saint-Georges, James Williford has an article in the National Endowment of the Humanities magazine called Black Mozart, which is useful, although I have to say the title Black Mozart seems a little unfair to the Chevalier de Saint-Georges.
Yeah, because he's like, if not a little before, then definitely contemporary with Mozart. So in some ways, I think Mozart might just be like the white Saint-Georges.
And Professor Michel Garnier-Panafieux has a website called Le Chevalier de Saint-Georges that is quite comprehensive. And there are two good books, Gabriel Banat's The Chevalier de Saint-Georges and Alain Gued's Monsieur de Saint-Georges. And Gabriel Banat was himself a violinist, so he's got a lot of good insights into the actual music side of things.
All right. Well, I think that about covers our badasses for today. We want to say thanks as always for listening to the show, and we'll be back next week with another set of badasses to talk about.
Badass of the Week is an iHeartRadio podcast produced by High Five Content. Executive producers are Andrew Jacobs, me, Pat Larish, and my co-host, Ben Thompson. Writing is by me and Ben. Story editing is by Ian Jacobs, Brandon Phibbs. Mixing and music and sound design is by Jude Brewer. Special thanks to Noel Brown at iHeart. Badass of the Week is based on the website badassoftheweek.com, where you can read all sorts of stories about other badasses. If you want to reach out with questions, ideas, you can email us at badasspodcast@badassoftheweek.com. If you like the podcast, subscribe, follow, listen, and tell your friends and your enemies if you want, as we'll be back next week with another one. For more podcasts from iHeartRadio, visit the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts.